Let's go, Asa. Success is calling. Asambi, let's go, Asa. No more and be more. Asambi, let's go, Asa. Asambi, let's go, Asa. Asambi, let's go, Asa. Success is calling. Asambi, let's go, Asa. Asambi, let's go, Asa.
Sorry, Macau, you're on mute.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our student funding webinar. My name is Macau Dibakwani, the Chief Executive Officer at Fundi Capital. Welcome to all our participants. Also welcome to our esteemed speakers and our panelists. It is an honor for Fundi to be hosting this webinar, as student funding is a critical mandate for our organization, and it has been for the past 26 years. Our mission is to enable educational dreams of South Africans, and as such, we believe that student funding is one of the key enablers to unlocking the potential of young South Africans and all those that want to improve their career prospects. So from our perspective, student funding is a ticket to a lifelong journey of education as well as personal success. I am delighted to host this webinar, and I look forward to our discussions on the issues, the different challenges, but more importantly, the possible partnerships and collaborations that will help us to solve and bring about solutions for these challenges, particularly the missing middle and the financially excluded students. My job today is very easy. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our MC, our moderator, Thembekile Mrototo. Thembekile is a radio and television news anchor, currently working with Eyewitness News and Newsroom Africa. Thembekile started his career in broadcasting as a news reader on community radio in Bloemfontein when he was 19 years old. Since then, he's gone on to present breaking news and national events on Talk Radio 702, 94.7, ENCA, and Newsroom Africa. He is currently part of the Anele and the Club of 94.7 and presents the daytime update at noon on channel 405 on DSTV. Please help me welcome Thembekile to help us moderate today's session. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I hope that you are all able to hear me. It is a pleasure to be here with all of you this morning as we talk about a very important topic in South Africa, the issue of student funding. It is so important in a country with our socioeconomic layout, especially to make sure that as many young people as possible are able to access opportunities in tertiary education. And we've seen just how important it has been in the past, especially in the last decade, with even movements such as the Fees Must Fall movement. So it is an honor to be here, courtesy of Fundi and the Mail Guardian today, to be part of a very important conversation that will hopefully be able to not just reflect on the problems, but also help us shape some of the solutions to help this country and its youth move forward. Now, we've got esteemed panelists, as you've heard today, student representatives. We've got the VCs of two of the country's universities, so really people with experience of just how student funding problems play themselves out daily on campus. And in fact, the first person we're going to hear from this morning is the VC of the University of Zululand, Professor Xoliswa Ntose. Now, before I introduce the prof, let's just have a look at her very impressive CV. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Fort Hare, a higher diploma in education, postgraduate primary, from the University of Cape Town, also Bachelor of Honours in African Languages from Rhodes University, and a Master's of Philosophy in Higher Education from the University of Stellenbosch. She was also honored to be endowed with a Howard South African Scholarship, which enabled her to study at Harvard in the US, furthering studies as part of her doctoral degree work. She holds a PhD in psychology from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. And allow me now to welcome Professor Xoliswa Ntose, Vice Chancellor of the University of Zululand.
Good morning, sir, and thank you, Mr. Mrototo, for introducing me this morning to the CEO of Fundi, as well as Chartered Accountants, Mr. Thembekile. The moderator is you, Mr. Mrototo, my colleague and Vice Chancellor, UJ, Professor Mpedi, Helm Senior Associate, Dr. Schreiber, and the SRC President and Presidents of SRC present here. But this far, I know Ms. Kyala is with us. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a profound honor to address this August webinar on the vexing question of student funding that has loomed large in national consciousness and the entire South African body politic for decades. My purpose and contribution are to highlight some key challenges and possible solutions articulated by higher education students in South Africa. As I explore these, I would like to add a rider that whatever shared understanding emerging in this webinar, we must be cognizant of the fact that by engaging in a complex discourse of student funding, it is important to adopt a critical and reflexive stance that raises awareness of how our own ideological orientations and the taken for granted assumptions influence the questions and solutions we come up with. In short, this presentation is an invitation to collectively delve into the terrain in an urgent quest to craft practical and sustainable approaches that will promote the expansion of participation of our young people in higher education, not only physically, but epistemically. Indeed, the simmering tensions at the chalk face that erupted during the 2015-2016 student campaigns underlined the fact that the problem can no longer be postponed. Inserting the context, I would like to say that having emerged from the apartheid system, which privileged historically white as opposed to black institutions, the post-1994 government came up with a policy framework in the form of White Paper 3 in 1997, which articulated the vision of a transformed higher education system that would be in harmony with a new democratic state. In short, the thrust of the White Paper was a two-pronged transformation agenda. First, there was a need to increase and broaden participation in order to overcome historically determined patterns of inequality and exclusion. The second aspect concerned the imperative to develop a higher education system that is positioned to respond to the needs of a democratic society. Today, nearly 30 years since the attainment of democracy, the extent to which funding of higher education has advanced the attainment of this vision largely remains an enduring conundrum that manifests itself as an entanglement phenomenon that cannot be understood and addressed in isolation of the historical heritage struggles and other wider societal transformations. The realization of transformation goals in South African higher education system has been rocked by two key elements which are in tension with each other. On the one hand, there has been evolving policy positions on government budget allocations on the sector. On the other hand, there has been an overriding principle in South Africa's higher education funding that costs must be shared between students and other families and government. Wangenge Oma Kapitier in 2018 has argued that the complex relationship between higher education institutions, the state and society, I open quote, are manifested among others by a mismatch between state funding and political expectations on the one hand, and on societal and institutional realities, the expectations on the other hand, close quote. For many years, researchers and policymakers struggled to come up with solutions that address student funding challenges articulated through the discourses, which include inadequacy of public funding mechanism for allocating subsidy to universities, tuition fees, student financial aid, student debt, and third stream income, among others. In 2015-2016, as the CEO has already indicated earlier in his introduction, #Fees Must Fall student protest that broke out across the country initially articulated a cocktail of demands, which included the rejection of proposed fee increases and cancellation of historical debt. The campaign quickly shifted to two other hashtags, #Roads Must Fall and #Outsourcing Must Fall. While all these had different but overlapping emphasis, they converged on the urgency of accelerating transformation of the sector. As the compendium of issues raised with the hashtags framework gained momentum and intensity, they surprised the state, education institutions, and the society at large. The government was jolted into action and capitulated to student demands, but not raising fees. That's what we encountered as higher education institutions. Then in 2017, came an unexpected announcement from the then state president Zuma, who declared a new system of funding where the government would fully subsidize free higher education for those students whose households with a combination of income up to 350,000 per annum. With this pronouncement, the universities found themselves catching the political football launched by the president by having to find ways to implement the new policy in a matter of weeks. Given the scenario painted in the foregoing section, it is now pertinent to outline pitfalls to watch out for any debates about student funding. These are mainly of conceptual nature, which are reflected in a way the challenges have been framed and tackled. The struggle coalesced around the threefold areas of focus. The focus is access, quality, and cost. The different funding policy prompted by the student protest is grappling with the issue of the so-called missing middle. That is, students whose households with incomes within 350,000 per annum not covered in the declaration. Those that were just above 350, even if you are 351,000, you are excluded and not covered in the declaration. The problem at hand with regards to student funding in the manner in which missing middle has been defined. It has been defined according to the household income threshold, not their funding constraints and needs. These definitions assume that the missing middle students are a homogeneous group, and this has a potential to limit imagination about the offerings that are required for this diverse group of students. Acknowledging the highly differentiated nature of missing middle will enable a diversely differentiated funding landscape for the missing middle students. Within the missing middle, there's a wide range of groupings with broad funding needs, complexities, and vulnerabilities. I will mention only three for the purposes of this presentation. Number one, the self-paying students. Self-paying category contains students who rely on their own financial resources. Number two, credit-funded students. This category contains student funded through loans and debit who rely on the credit worthiness of their guardians and parents. Number three, NSFAS eligible non-funded. The missing middle being students from homes where the household income is between 0 and 350,000 per annum is significant as it raises other group of students who become part of the missing middle. And I'm going to tell you how. Some students get into higher education qualified within the threshold and they become eligible students. But for some reasons, they lose NSFAS. The most of these students, credit funding is not an option for their household income, precludes them from a loan or an option for most likely to be bursaries. Because this is how it works. If you come in within this threshold, and then for some reason, either a student fails or a student gets sick, you become a dropout, or you take longer than N+1 in the university, then you fall into the category of students who are missing middle. That is the kind of a definition that I would like us as a country to embrace, not to see these students as qualifying only within the threshold, but look at the needs, the complexities, and the vulnerability of this group of students called missing middle. The loan scheme seeks to fund the missing middle students as Fundi does. Research on loan scheme conducted in 2017 estimates that 85.6% of all households in the low-income category earning less than 350,000 per annum, given the high levels of poverty in our country, only 11% of households fall into missing middle category targeted by the loan scheme. There is a need to review a number of solutions to missing middle funding, outlining a number of loan and bursary options already available within the student funding landscape. I say this with caution and understanding that whilst we're looking at loan schemes, we should be looking also after the interest, particularly of the poor, of the poorest of this country, that find themselves falling into the missing middle. The third part of the student campaigns was an elusive cost of education conundrum. In considering this issue, governments and funding partners are warned against falling into the trap of a tacit acceptance of funding fiscal limitations of the state. We owe it as a country to the poor of the poorest that they deserve, and it is their equal right to be educated. Without arguing, the issue of financial constraints must not be considered when making financial choices. I would like to highlight the dangerous a priori acceptance that there simply is not enough money to increase funding to higher education as well as offer free education. The question of affordability in higher education has been challenged by Motala et al. When they stated that, I open quote, "In effect, we are simply asked to accept the unqualified assertion that it is unaffordable on the grounds inter alia that it would be fiscally reckless since there is no likelihood to expand fiscal provision through prevailing tax base, poor economic growth, and competing demands on the state resources." In other words, unaffordability is arrived at without any examination of the state's resources, capabilities, except in relation to the present allocation of higher education in particular, and without reference as to what choices are made by institutions in the distribution of state and other resources, close quote. The authors propose that they refer as a less submissive perspective of fiscal realism, pointing for the need for a reformulation of social goals, especially those that concern the case for higher education. Whatever its complexities, it is against this thinking that the arguments about limits of the quantum of money required to cover funding for all, including the missing middle, must be included in the debate. What I really want to propose is a practical, sustainable funding solution. I've considered all the above and elaboration of what student movement expressed as a necessity and necessary humanic backdrop against which to think about practical and sustainable solutions to student funding question. In the last decade, the higher education sector has been abuzz with a search for solutions to the funding question. During this period, there have been several concerted efforts in a form of various national fora, task teams, and others focused on addressing the funding challenges students face in higher education in South Africa. For this, it has been argued that one of the most comprehensive was the Hege report published in 2017. The Commission listed a number of options, many of which are yet to be implemented. However, before some of these Commission's recommendations could be implemented, the Spontaneous Students' Crusade, which touched on the key principles of equality, quality, cost, and sustainability that underpin higher education funding in South Africa today, emphasize the need to urgently come up with the practical and sustainable student funding solutions. Maybe it is the right time for me to declare that I have led one of the ministerial task teams, which has also presented a report, but still on consultation stage with stakeholders for it to be approved by Cabinet. I will not touch the recommendations that I've made and with my team on that report because they are still confidential at the moment. But given the entanglement of the phenomenon of student funding issues as demonstrated above, I would like to argue that tackling the quagmire requires an integrated and coordinated approach involving multiple stakeholders, as I'll be summarizing them in the presentation that I would like Sean to put up my presentation. And in this is my construction of an integrated and sustainable South African higher education student funding solution set that I want to propose in this conference. As you can see, the approach requires the building of self-reinforcing network of multiple stakeholders who generate revenue and expenditure in a way designed to meet other imperatives such as equity, quality, success in higher education, and wider society. The actors must have a culture of collaboration, be competent in what they do, and possess the capacity to deliver on what they are expected to do. Funding students must be seen as an enabling factors, that multiplier effects that should sustain the funding ecosystem. The figure depicts actors located and operating. Please keep that, Sean, keep it there, because I'm making reference to it. And I would like people to read as I present. The figure depicts actors located and operating in 5 clusters of areas of action. I hope you see that. The 5 clusters, they are in blue. On one hand, there's a funding pillar, which encapsulates streams of revenue that can be identified and engaged for the purposes of funding the university. Examples of agencies within this pillar are listed, and Fundi is one of them. If you go down that list of streams of revenues under funding pillar, you will see that what I'm referring to here. On the other hand, employment pillar, defined in a broad sense to include people engaged in activities that generate income, whether as paid labor within an organization or self-created work. Examples of the value they created are also listed. An example is research and development, partnerships, other forms of knowledge production, skilled productive forces, entrepreneurs, and all that. That they are listed under employment pillar. These 2 pillars are interconnected, if you look at that diagram, through their interactions with the local and global economy, and regulated by the state at the bottom, the state through prevailing policy and legislative environment. The frame also depicts a circular flow of financial impacts and value. For example, in an ideal situation, funds flowing from the funding pillar are channeled through universities. Then within university, the human capital and human capabilities are produced under the employment pillar, as you see, who then move into employment pillar to create value in terms of knowledge, skills, etc. Some of which feed the economy to contribute to the growth of gross domestic product, the GDP, and some other which are plowed back to the university to enhance and sustain its core business. Depending on the size of GDP, the state must then play its role in deciding what proportion of GDP goes to funding higher education. Hopefully, the higher education, the GDP, the higher will be the resources which go to higher education and other sectors in society which compete for the same cake. That said, the real world is far from ideal, where the frame can work like a well-oiled machine. If you look at this ecosystem, if this can work, indeed, as a country, we would go far. My closing thoughts. As I conclude, it is my hope that this presentation has provided a foundation upon which a conceptual, theoretical, and ideological toolkit can be produced and used to deconstruct the research and policy options that can lead to progressive and sustainable student funding models for South Africa. While acknowledging that much work has gone into searching for enduring a fit-for-purpose solutions to student funding, there remains much more work to be done. In exploring topography of the debate in the context of ongoing crisis related to university funding, as well as FET colleges, funding in this country, I attempted to unravel what research studies, various commissions and task teams may not be telling us. What comes into mind in this connection is the colonial matrix of power that works in serious ways to achieve compliance and make people take for granted the idea. For example, the fiscal limitations of the state and the work of producing new funding models based on such a priori position instead of questioning it. In such an approach lacks the danger of coming up with solutions which may have unintended consequences of reproducing the very system of social relations it is sought to transform. I call upon Fundi as one of the agencies that play a role of being a funding pillar to play an enabling culture effects that should sustain funding ecosystem that I have elaborated above. As part of the repertoire of insights, I recommend to those charged with making decisions about student funding is a nuanced understanding of how power manifests structurally within society and at the intersection of various interests reflected in various social identities within society of race, class, and gender, and others. And I thank you very much.
Of Zululand. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that keynote address this morning. You've given us plenty to think about as we continue to reflect on student funding in South Africa from its genesis as far as the problems are concerned, and as you were just showing us now, the various options available in terms of addressing what is a national problem. I mean, just this year, if you were listening to the Minister, Bladen Zimande, Minister for Higher Education, talking about the state of readiness for the start of the 2023 academic year, NSFAS alone, the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, is going to have to spend about 47 billion rand in making sure that some 900,000 students are able to study in this country just this year. When you look at some of the other alarming data, over 60% of undergraduate students at public universities in this country are dependent on support from NSFAS. If you go to TVET college level, the number is even more alarming. That's 90% of TVET students who are NSFAS beneficiaries, people who without that help would not be able to study. But as you were saying now, Professor Mdose, there's also the category of the missing middle, people who, according to the system, have families that earn too much to be able to qualify for government funding, but also earn too little to be able to get private funding from the banks, for instance. So that segues then nicely into our first panel for this morning. And I'm going to introduce our panelists, including Professor Xoliso Mdose. Prof, please stand by for us because we're going to be joined now by Dr. Birgit Schreiber, who is a senior associate at Helm. She holds a PhD as a senior expert for international higher education sector and has served in senior leadership posts with expertise in sub-Saharan Africa and Europe higher education. I did say earlier that we also have student representation among us, and that is Abusheni Kyala, an SRC president who herself is a graduate with a degree in BA Law and Sociology. This was back in 2021. She's gone on to further her studies and has graduated with an honors degree in industrial psychology and is now studying towards an LLB. Rounding off our panel this morning is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Letlhokwa Mpedi. He's got a long list of accolades. I'll just give you a sense of some of them. He completed studying at the Oxford Advanced Management and Leadership Program offered by the Oxford University, and said business school and policy program presented by the John F. Kennedy School of Government. Here at home, he studied at the Rand Afrikaans University, which is now the University of Johannesburg, where he's the man in charge. Professor Mpedi has also published widely in the fields of social security and labor law in South Africa, Southern Africa, and Anglophone Africa. Most recently, he co-authored Labor Law in Ghana. So with that, then, my thanks to all our panelists, and thank you for joining us. If I could come to you, Dr. Schreiber, having just heard the professor's presentation, are we in this quagmire, this situation of student funding, because of policy or because of mainly our socio-economic history as a country?
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the listeners, and especially Prof. Mtoza this morning for her words and her presentation. And thank you also for this question. It's not an either or, of course. We're not in this because of the one or the other. We're in this because we've had years of mismanagement of funding and years of yesteryear models of higher education. We need to somehow get back to the idea that education and tertiary education and primary and secondary is a public good. It needs to be funded first and foremost by the public sector. The public sector are taxpayers who pay towards government. Government, in various forms and however it does it, needs to be responsible for education. Education is what produces more taxpayers of tomorrow. It produces our skill set, our expertise in the country. So it is funding education, makes us more money as a country and makes our country better. So I would like to see government to be much clearer on saying that all its efforts, be that transport, be that safety, be that water and electricity, is geared towards educating our youth, because it is through education are we going to sustain tomorrow. Mm-hmm. So I would like to do a lot of, talking and aiming of, dare I say, blame. It's not a blame conversation, but it is saying where are our solutions coming from? The public sector, the private sector and the banks can step in, but they shouldn't be the ones who are called in as a matter of course. And neither are the universities responsible for the funding. They're responsible for teaching and learning. So it is a public good. It is taxpayers' money that needs to go into educating a nation. And we need to, every ministry in the government sector needs to think about how do we support education. Education must come first. And we know, by the way, from other case studies across the world, I always cite Kerala in India, where every ministry focused on supporting education for, it was 8 to 10 years, it was a 10-year plan, and they started a year late. But it turned around that province, that part of India, in a way that made it very productive because people became educated, productive, and contributed to the lives of everyone.
Mm-hmm. And just to remind everyone who is part of this webinar today that you can also leave us your comments and questions, and we'll reflect on those as we continue with this conversation. Let me bring in the Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, Professor Mpedi. We're just reflecting on what Dr. Schreiber says. It needs to be a move towards making education a public good. All sectors, as far as the government and the departments are concerned, pulling in one direction to make sure that it is as accessible as possible. Do you think it's doable in the current climate?
Yes, good morning, Program Director. Good morning to fellow panelists and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, it is doable. As you have rightly pointed out, we all need to pull towards the same direction. But one thing that I want to emphasize this morning is that as we tackle the issue of funding, student funding, we must also look at other surrounding things that impact on this. Today, we're dealing with challenges such as the lack of electricity or challenges with load shedding. Universities are spending millions of rands on diesel to keep the lights on. This is money that is not readily available. And now the lack of energy is also impacting on water supply. Universities are spending millions to truck in water to keep students hydrated and other programs running. It's money that we don't have. And if we didn't have these other challenges, this is the money that should be invested in the academic project. I also want to add by saying we need a public-private partnership to deal with these issues. As they say, you know, in many African languages, it takes a village to raise a child. I want to use this opportunity to say we are all responsible to make sure that our students get education, which is a human right.
And just on that, I'll come back to the point you're making, Prof, around public partnership, public-private partnerships, and also how much more expensive it's become to go about the business of studying and teaching in light of load shedding and the rest of it. But I want to bring in Abusheni. We're hearing this morning, Abusheni, about the need to pull together, everyone being responsible. But as a student in South Africa today, do you feel as though those in charge are alive to your concerns, your challenges, and the need to find solutions and find them urgently? Abusheni, I think you're muted.
Am I audible?
There we go. Now we can hear you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for the platform, and thank you and good morning to everyone present. I think it's going back to what both profs have said. There's a lack of collaboration, there's a lack of cohesiveness. So when people are alive to it, it happens in isolation. I know last week we got a call from the Motsepe Foundation that they were going to donate 800,000 to Rhodes University. And it's things like that that make you hopeful as a student that our cries are not falling on deaf ears. But I think it's just disheartening again that these things like these, acts like these, they happen in isolation. They happen once in a while. And it goes back to say, okay, this happened for my university in this year, but is there continuity in it? Can we expect this to happen next year? What are the guarantees that when we face crises like this, it won't fall on deaf ears again?
How difficult would you say it is, Abusheni, as someone who's working with students, how difficult is it today for young people to get into a university based on funding alone?
It's extremely difficult. I think right now I'm in the SRC offices and it's busy. It's phone calls, it's emails, it's tears. It's very disheartening because if we look at the numbers, for example, we are looking at 855 students who cannot register. Why can't they register? Majority of them are waiting for their appeals to come through. When will their appeals come through? Probably by the time March hits or even April hits, and now they're disadvantaged in the academic program. So it's people who are coming here to the SRC offices desperate, pleading for any type of assistance, and it's disheartening as a student leader not to be able to give those type of assistance straight away because the structures that we look to assist us are failing us. So it's a very difficult time to be a student right now.
Professor Mdosa, let's bring you back into the conversation. Abusheni speaks of a great difficulty for young people to even get started as far as accessing tertiary education. The other sense I'm getting today is that there's a lot of work happening, but a lot of it is happening in silos. Why is that? Professor Mdosa, are you able to hear us? All right, let me go back to Dr. Schreiber while we wait to get Professor Mdosa back online. Dr. Schreiber, let's talk about... we can hear you now, ma'am. Did you catch my question? I was just asking about everyone working in silos.
Well, I would say yes and no. There are situations where, as the organization of South African vice chancellors, we work together and we share these experiences and challenges that we encounter. However, in terms of the funding patterns for the country, I think the mistake we can make in this conference is to suggest that the NSFAS as an organization that is responsible for funding our poor, based on my presentation and experience, that it's a terrible mistake for us to forget that not all of our students at the end of the day qualify for NSFAS. Like Ms. Kiana is alluding to the fact that even when you qualify, let's say you didn't qualify in 2021, now you come back because you've done well in 2022, you've got to do your application to say, can I be considered again? It takes a long time to get there. And if you understand that you are working with the poor of the poorest, particularly in my university, what we have decided to do is to say, if there's hope that NSFAS will grant you the money at the end, we pay for everything at the beginning. For example, yesterday already, my students had their first allowance. I've not been paid, but I take from the resources to say, let's serve the students. Because the danger, Mr. Mrototo, is that if we don't support students at the beginning of the year, they are missing a lot of time in their academic agenda. And therefore, the results by June are looking so bad because people were hungry, people were struggling all the way. So for me, it's a question of us as a country understanding the level of depth of what we call inequalities of our country. We cannot take away the history of this country by pretending that when we put one level of the so-called help for the poor, that eradicates all kinds of other challenges that our poor students are facing. It is a reality that some students come in a university and you hear stories that so-and-so has been lying in his room because he could not have food for 3 days. How do you expect such a student to get into the classroom and study? So for me, the PPP that my colleagues are referring to, if we are a country that is looking at in its totality and say, why is the public-private sector, when our people are struggling like this? Because the government, that's the truth we have, cannot cover all the needs of our people. Yes, the promises are made for certain periods, as we know, but those promises do not translate to the realities that we face in these institutions.
And just on that, I mean, your university at Zululand, you're now making arrangements to allow students to be able to study in the promise that the NSFAS process will be favorable. How much room to maneuver do you have as institutions to make those sort of decisions, given that money is said to be tight all around?
The money, yes, is tight. But my view is that the money will be tighter if these students cannot come back to the system and study, because you're going to lose your subsidy at the end. So for me, it's looking at a holistic approach and say, do I close the doors for these students not to come back? Then it's got an impact on the enrollment targets. So a position we have taken as a university is to say that we assist students to come in, but then what becomes the condition for the finances is something that we encounter at a later stage, and we confront it. And I do want to say that it is not an easy way to maneuver all these things, but you look at each case as an individual case. It can't be that students who were in a better condition last year and then we were confronted with COVID, students were depressed, there were mental illnesses, people have lost parents, their conditions have changed, they've not applied for NSFAS because they did not know that this is the condition they will find themselves in. So some of the burden of the poor as institutions of higher learning, I'm sure even Professor Pedi will confirm to this, that as universities, we swallow so much burden for the benefit of our students. But it's not something that we go to the mountain and start saying, we're doing so well now, this is how we're looking at the poor. No, but it's something that I feel personally, it's my responsibility. If I came from the same background as these students come from, it is my responsibility to ensure that we change the atmosphere and the future of our young people.
Professor Mbedi, I see you nodding there. Let me ask you about the situation at UJ. How much of the pressure are you able to absorb as an institution?
Thank you very much. We are in more or less the same position. At the beginning of the year, we took a calculated risk and looked at those applications and covered and allowed the NSFAS students to register. This is an ongoing thing. I would say we managed at least to provide to around 800 students. So this is the last information I had, that we could enable them to register. But in taking this risk, we say it's a calculated risk because these are really top performing students that irrespective of the outcome of the NSFAS, we hope is favorable, but we will still be able to accommodate them in one way or another. I agree with my colleague that if you don't take measures and if you're not proactive, you would end up losing out in terms of enrolling good students. And we come from the same background. We know this pain. So to answer you, the last time I checked, we had around 800 students that we are helping. But remember, it is not only NSFAS students. We have other ways in which we enable students to register. And I'll talk about this. We've got the so-called SRC Trust Fund, where we provide 20 million annually to help students to be able to register.
And Professor Ndosa in her presentation earlier was telling us about how, for example, the missing middle group of students, those who are, again, deemed too poor to apply for private funding through a bank, or have, according to the system, too much of a family income to get NSFAS assistance. She said they're not a homogenous group. And that challenges us, I suppose, to find different solutions for what the Prof was saying are the complexities and the vulnerabilities of each student, Prof.
Yeah, that is true. This is our experience, because you find that some students, even if they have money to come to varsity, they go for a day without a warm meal. As institutions, and as Prof Mtosa has pointed out, we don't climb the top of the hill and say, look, this is what we're doing, because it's what we have to do. For example, at UJ, we provide, we've got feeding schemes for our students so that they go for a day with a warm meal. They don't go hungry. How can you study without a warm meal? We also have other interventions that we are providing to ensure that our students, particularly those that are vulnerable, can manage to continue with their studies, and not only continue, but so that they can complete their studies. And I want to add something here. When I look at this, last year we started a campaign called Double Our Future Impact, because when our students graduate, this is the future. And here at UJ, we've got a number of students that were supported through the feeding schemes and so on. And I want to use this opportunity today to call upon them to remember where they come from and help us, join forces with us to help other students who are in the position that they were before. Thembekile, I want to mention one thing already at this stage while I have a platform. In South Africa, and this is indeed the situation on the African continent, we don't have the culture of giving. We cannot deal with this challenge alone. We don't have the culture of giving. It's not only companies that must give, but also us as individuals who should contribute to the best of our abilities to support our students. I contributed 50,000 to support 10 students register. Obviously, that alone is not enough, and I'll still contribute. I'm saying every rent counts.
All right. Dr. Schwaber, let me bring you back in, because you did speak about the need for this holistic approach, right?
Yeah.
And both VCs are saying it's one thing to bring students onto campus and have, quote unquote, bums on seats able to study. But we then, once they are there, need to make sure that they are fed, their mental well-being is seen to, they are accommodated.
Yeah.
Could part of the solution, I wonder, be bringing down prices for higher education? Is it overpriced?
So it's a complex question. I want to, before we go on, to say that a student is a contextualized student, a situated learner. They don't just need money to be successful. They need all kinds of other things to be successful, as all of us do. But I want to be careful to belabor universities with entire responsibilities for this. Universities, we have a public sector health a health public sector that ought to be functioning. We should have running water, not having to bus in water to campuses. We should have running electricity, not have to pay for diesel to make our electricity work. So the universities have to do an enormous amount on a broad spectrum in order to create an environment that is safe, that is secure, that has running water and lights go on for students to study. And so I want to be careful that we don't belabor universities with an entire job of making this possible. However, we live in an environment that is dysfunctional. So we need to help ourselves. So we get the diesel, we get the water. So I just want to say, let us not forget that we need a wider context that is functional. I want to go back to the opening statement where it says that finance is a ticket to success. It is a ticket. But if we don't have buses or roads or trains or tracks, or if these trains and tracks are not safe and our waters don't go on, then that is not a useful ticket. So having finances is a tiny bit. It's an important bit. It's a must-have. But if the environment around it is dysfunctional as we currently have it, this is a very, very vulnerable, a very fragile position for us to be in. So it has to really, we have to lobby much broader at government to say it's not good enough the way this electricity works. It is not good enough that we're worrying already about water up in Joburg. This is, one can't work like that.
And just on that, Prof, I mean, when we were listening to Professor Ndosa earlier, she was talking about how universities basically ended up catching a political football in 2017 when the announcement was made that there'd be changes in the allocation of funds when we had that threshold that if you earned, or your family earned up to 350,000 Rand a year, you could then be able to study. But if you even cross that by 1,000 Rand, you're left out in the lurch. How do we improve that? Dr. Schreiber?
Oh, you're asking me how to improve that? I'm not sure exactly about how to improve that somebody falls out the 350. I don't know what that's, so I think that, I think I want to just affirm what Prof. Mtosi says about that we need to approach these individual cases individually. We need to say somebody's just fallen outside of the NSFAS funding and is not able to get private. How do we help those in the middle? And again, we need to do it. If nobody else does it, for sure we need to do this. I love the approach of saying it's an individual thing.
Actually, let me come back to you then from an SRC perspective. What do you see as the role of students on campus in getting out of the position that we're in? I mean, Professor Mbedi was talking about how graduates themselves should be encouraged to give back and help to pay it forward, basically fund the next generation of students. You're muted again.
Am I audible?
There we go.
Okay, perfect. Sorry, so I was saying, I think as student leaders, the biggest responsibility that we have is cultivating these spaces where we can give back. So I know in terms of my SRC, we want to look at making these funding opportunities, making these funding fairs where we invite different stakeholders now. Because now we've decided as the SRC, it's not enough to say that there's nobody funding the LLB or there's nobody funding the PGCE by NSFAS. It's time that we invite these stakeholders to our campuses and ask them, what are they offering? Putting pressure on them from a student leader perspective. So I think, especially from my position as the SLC president, it's mostly about the agency of students now, for us to now look out and get these people instead of just sitting back and waiting for it to happen.
And why do you think, Abusheni, when we all agree on a common problem that people need to study, the current T's and C's aren't working, why does it always culminate in protests on campus about the same thing every year, be it about allowing new students or, for example, this year we've seen the conversation around historic debt, people unable to study into their second or third year because they've got an outstanding balance from the previous one?
I don't think it's a situation where people are automatically gravitating towards protest, but I think you must know there is such a detrimental mental health effect, and progressing effect when we are kind of repeating the conversation. I think the frustration from students is that the same issue that happened this year is the same issue that's happening last year, which is the same issue that is happening when I was in high school. So I think it gets to that point when it feels like as students we are repeating the same issues, but nothing is being done about it. And then when it gets to a point where it's protests and strikes, there seems to be a shock factor, but it's no, these are the repeated conversations that nothing has been done about.
Professor Mdose, how do we avoid getting there where ultimately you're dealing with what is a confrontation between frustrated students, rightly so, because they want to study, and institutions that say, well, we'd love for you to study, but the conditions are just not allowing for that to happen in a harmonious way? Prof, you're also muted.
You do? Okay.
We can hear you now.
I can say it's unavoidable simply because you can help and you can push as far as you can go, but there are limits because an institution is also governed in terms of the finances. The level of burden, if you look at the research that has been done to say what is the level of debt that these students, these universities are carrying, is huge. And that is why at a certain point you've got to cut off. For example, for me, I do have sympathy for being poor. I don't have sympathy for failure because I don't understand why should we be pouring money where people are not seeing that value for money, because students are quick to say there must be value for money in terms of the quality of what you give us. Therefore, we should turn around too as academics and say there must be value for money. For example, this year, I would have made a mistake if I do not appreciate the Motsepe Foundation for granting our students, all our SRCs, equally 1.1 million. And my SRC came back excited. And one message I have, and I had, don't fail the foundation that has looked at us and the poverty that we endure, and fail them by not investing that money in people who will make sure that that money is productive at the end of the day. So this one message that I want to say, that it's unavoidable. For example, where I am at the University of Zululand, most of the time, the strike here is not on the conditions of people not being able to register. I was telling my SRC, amazingly, even yesterday, I said, now we have come to a point where we have almost registered every person eligible, whether you've got money or not. But this is the time when the political influence from outside comes into the university and disrupts the university. Ms. Yala, I can vouch, you can ask my president. None of my strikes at this university are related to being unable to register per se, but the political influence in this region is the cause, because people here tend to take the SRC and the students as the property of politicians. That is the problem I have in this region. So what I would also like to say is that we're struggling, and we need to say this publicly, and we need to beg our parents to say, those that can afford, can we stop being selfish? You take your child to a private school. Private schools here in Durban, there are so many of them. You go and pay 300 and something thousand and even more annually. And when that child comes to university, all of a sudden, the child needs NSFAS. You look at these kids that are coming from these families that are driving cars, but they are beneficiaries of NSFAS. And somehow, we need to confront this demon and say it must stop. We must understand that the majority of our people are in real need. Let's stop playing games and do all these things that we are doing. So for me, it is important to say, as a society, can we be conscious as the people of this country and say we give opportunity to those that are in real need, not people that can afford, but you choose to buy a car as opposed to taking your child to a university.
All right, thanks for that, Prof. And perhaps we can pause the group aspect of our conversation for the moment, because we had asked you, Professor Letlokwa Mbedi, Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg, to also prepare a presentation as well for us today, just as we continue to get a sense of what you, as the people responsible for the day-to-day running of our institutions, are dealing with, and what you think individually are the solutions. We'll have a listen to you, Prof, and then after that, we'll go into our second group discussion, the panel, and then we'll look at solutions going forward. We'll still be joined by yourselves, the VCs, Abusheni Gyala, as well as Dr. Birgit Schreider. Prof. Mbedi, if you're able to hear us now, in fact, I know you're able to hear us. If you're ready for us, sir, let's hear from you.
Thank you very much, Thembekile. Really, this is an important discussion, and I'm so grateful that I could be invited to be part of it, because student funding is something that is close to my heart. In 2015, as it has already pointed out, the Fees Must Fall protest movement engulfed the nation. Protests began in Johannesburg and soon spread to every corner of the country, as we know. Against the dire economic backdrop, the desperate cry for access and funding reverberated through Parliament and the union buildings. Susan Boyson asserted, open quote, the movement unleashed social and political power that challenged the established political order, brought university managements to heel, and changed the social fabric of universities and of parts of society. Foundational values were to be considered, and the ideological basis laid bare and cast off. Policies were changed and institutions transformed, and the power of direct action to get radical results was affirmed, close quote. We are 8 years, ladies and gentlemen, on from this moment, but still challenges persist, as you have heard earlier. The pandemic helped us to pivot some solutions, but also created new and vastly different challenges. As Professor Ahmed Bauer phrased it, open quote, what became very apparent with the pandemic, apologies, was just how significantly unequal our system is, close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. This is a title we have held for a number of years, and this is according to the World Bank. These inequalities manifest themselves in a multitude of ways. In the higher education sector, however, the divisions are stark. There are divisions between those who have access to institutions and those who do not, of course. Then there are the divisions within our institutions, those who are state-funded, those who are self-funded, and then those who make up the missing middle, as we have heard earlier. At the start of every academic year, ladies and gentlemen, higher education institutions across the nation contend once again with students' protests and cries for solutions. The Fees Must Fall protest demonstrated the burden higher education places on families. Although there are interventions such as scholarships, funding through the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, commonly known as NSFAS, and at the University of Johannesburg, initiatives such as the Missing Middle Fund, there are many who fall through the cracks. Higher education, indeed, is still in crisis, ladies and gentlemen. And despite a marked increase in numbers of students in recent years, there has not been a concomitant increase in funding allocated to the sector. According to the PwC, it is estimated that the cost of delivering university education is around 50 billion annually. The state contributions have declined from 49% in 2000 to 40% by 2012, while the burden on students has increased from 24% to 31%. From 2010 to 2012, tuition fees at the 23 public universities in South Africa increased from 12.2 billion to 15.5 billion rands, while enrollments only increased by 7% during the period. At the same time, student debt rose from 2.6 billion to 3.4 billion, an increase of 31% over 2 years. Compounding this challenge, the NSFAS is buckling under the weight of weak economic performance. Statistics South Africa reports that the share of NSFAS funding increased from 20% in the 2011-2012 financial year to 44% in the 2020-2021 financial year. Moreover, the National Development Plan requires the higher education sector to increase enrollment levels annually from 950,000 in 2010 to 1.6 million by 2030. Ladies and gentlemen, unless we find ways to reduce the costs of delivering higher education, and increased enrollment will require increased funding. Policy uncertainty on student funding has played a significant role in student funding complexity. Government's focus on short-term solutions around student funding is one of the reasons this crisis has ballooned. In 2021, Acting Deputy Director General of the University Branch at the Department of Higher Education and Training warned that demand for space has outstripped the funding that's available. As she stated, open quote, "The department has had the fastest growing budget in government. So it may seem somewhat contradictory that we are still facing enormous sustainability challenges. However, government and the fiscus is really constrained, and university funding from the state is unable to keep up with the growth in the system," close quote. There are far-reaching consequences of these funding challenges. For instance, academically qualifying students who are not funded are at risk of achieving poor academic results and subsequently increasing the dropout rate. I agree with my colleague, Professor Mtose, that as we grapple with this issue of funding, the issue of being academically deserving should not be left out. Ladies and gentlemen, it is estimated that 40% do not complete their degrees. As we grapple with this issue of student funding, we must also attend to the issue of dropout rates and on-time completion. Ladies and gentlemen, according to a government review of the first 25 years of democracy published in 2019, in the 2010 cohort, 22% of students achieved a 3-year degree within 3 years. Only 39% had completed their degrees by the 4th year, and only 56% of students completed their degree by the 6th year. Additionally, the vast majority of our students come from impoverished communities. At UJ, in particular, 59% of our students come from disadvantaged backgrounds. Students therefore need bursaries to support postgraduate studies, and bursaries for full-time studies are limited, particularly in the social sciences and humanities. In light of this, many opt for part-time studies while they find employment. This often hampers their performance. Part-time students, ladies and gentlemen, are also often not able to publish their work or disseminate it to wider audiences apart from the required outputs due to time constraints. In some disciplinary areas, the university has the capacity to take on more postgraduate students. However, a lack of funding for students means that the full capacity is often not utilized, ladies and gentlemen. As the government review states, open quote, "The determination which has seen the students battle all odds to make it to their first year shows a hidden talent and resilience which the country can ill afford to lose. These measures are required to ensure they succeed when they reach university," close quote. Furthermore, universities have to spend additional financial resources to assist students in good academic standing. Once again, I agree with Prof. Mtose that good academic standing is important. We should not leave this out when we talk about student funding. However, ladies and gentlemen, the cost of student debt has ripple effect for institutions. Capital projects and strategic initiatives are withheld due to funds redirected to servicing the cost of student debt. Another factor to consider is that the income received from student tuition fees and from government subsidies through the teaching inputs units subsidy are the primary source of institutional income for most South African universities. While UJ is steadily growing its third stream income generated from external funders and the introduction of reskilling programs such as massive open online courses, short courses, and online campuses, the university remains heavily reliant on the income generated from student tuition fees and from student funding through state funding for its financial stability, sustainability, and longevity. These are important, ladies and gentlemen. When we talk about student funding, we should not forget financial stability. We should not forget the importance of sustainability, and we should not forget the importance of the longevity of our institutions. As such, ladies and gentlemen, student funding dictates the spending and allocation of institutional income towards the resources to further advance and enhance the academic and research agenda of the university. This includes investment in professional development, retention and recruitment of quality academic and research staff, as well as in research projects and the global excellence and stature strategy of the university. The impact on research has direct effect on the rankings of universities, as most global rankings focus on research-intensive universities based on metrics such as research productivity, research quality and impact, research excellence, research collaboration, and international academic colleagues, income generated for research purposes, and so on. In addition, university rankings are starting to incorporate metrics on student opinions, gathered through student surveys, asking students to give their views on their university experience with various aspects, including student funding. Thus, the challenges that students experience with student funding will not inform and influence their opinion on their overall university experience, ultimately affecting rankings outcomes. Though this is seemingly a superfluous aspect of those not in the higher education sphere, rankings are important for third stream funding, for the stature of universities, for competition, collaboration, and cooperation. Given these complexities, ladies and gentlemen, how do we respond? I will first speak to some of the initiatives at UJ. UJ spends over 10 million on student meal assistance program annually. This assists approximately 4,600 students monthly. In partnership with industry, we have also raised close to 2 billion since 2016 to assist missing middle students. Since 2009, UJ has made 20 million available every year to assist financially needy students with their registration fees. This contribution has enabled UJ to assist more than 5,000 students register per year. Based on our determination to support students that are academically deserving and financially needy, I must stress financially needy, also to underscore the point made by my colleague, Professor Mrototo, that those people that can pay, they must pay, so that we can focus on those that are indeed financially needy. In December, ladies and gentlemen, 2022, we launched the Double Our Future Impact campaign, which aims to assist as many as 10,000 students in 2023. At this stage, ladies and gentlemen, we have raised close to 3 million in donations, and I'm grateful to all those that have contributed to this project. However, there are wider sector-wide considerations. Firstly, what is required is private partnership collaborations, as I pointed out earlier, to address the student funding shortfall. Secondly, a strategy in managing student funding is required, supported by government, of course. Thirdly, our energy needs to be focused on raising funds to assist students who completed their studies and are due to graduate but have an outstanding debt. If we have any hope of expanding access to education, these are some of the challenges we have to address with urgency. While UJ has done a lot in this space, more is required and wider interventions need to be considered. As the outgoing Vice Chancellor of UJ, Professor Chilizi Marwala, put it, open quote, we have to consider in all this what can be done feasibly by a university and what must be placed at the door of the state, close quote. Ladies and gentlemen, if we are to address the South African condition marked by inequality and inaccess, we have to play our part as institutions while simultaneously calling for change higher up. I would like to take this opportunity and echo the sentiments expressed by Prof. Mrototo and also express our gratitude to the Motsepe Foundation for the generous donation they made to SRCs throughout the country or at institutions of higher learning. This is public institutions. I understand that they contributed in total 30 million. We need more of such generous contributions to join forces with us, institutions of higher learning, and help our students, because they are the future. Lastly, Mr. Program Director, I want to leave you, before we move over to the discussion, with this saying that is quite deep. It's an African saying that the youth, if it's not given the warmth, by the community that it lives in, it will burn the village down to feel its warmth. I'm not advocating for our youth to burn. I'm saying our youth should work with us to confront these challenges, but the communities out there cannot leave this only to the universities. We need to pull our resources together, join forces, and contribute in developing this future generation. Our students are the future. And as I always say, every rand counts. If anybody contribute 10 rands to support our students, it's 10 rands that we didn't have. So please, let's work together and support our institutions of higher learning. And to our students, we are not the enemy. Let's invest our energies to work together towards this common goal and stop destroying what is already in place, because burning properties because you are grieved by something does not help. Let's work together. Thank you so much for your attention.
Professor Mbedi, thank you so much, Vice Chancellor of the University of Johannesburg. Let's keep you with us, Prof, because we're going to continue our discussion as a group now, bring back in the rest of the panel. Professor Xolisa Mdose, Vice Chancellor of the University of Zululand, still with us. We also still have Dr. Birgit Schreiber with us as well as Abusheni Kyala, SRC President. One more addition today. You saw him earlier if you joined from right at the beginning. Bring in Mr. Mahau Dibakwane, CEO at Fundi. And Mr. Dibakwane, if I can give you the floor first. We're talking about pulling together, work together, make this work. And Prof said that every rand counts. How do we take the little that we have and make it work for everyone?
Thank you very much, Dr. Mrototo, on the opportunity to say a few words. I think for us as Fundi, I mean, we actually, have the benefit and luxury of being in the middle of all of this, and we are observing, and we want to be part of the solution. So I think at the end of the day, this is all about leverage, right? It's about how do we able to stretch what we have. Prof. Mtose and Prof. Betty have raised very, very good points around how do we actually manage to pull all our resources together. I mean, we pull our resources together, first of all, through technology. We gotta be able to know what we don't know, correct? We need to be able to ascertain, which students are in need, which students are actually in dire straits. We need to know who are the people that actually are abusing the system, as also have been indicated, because there's a lot of ways, because I mean, we need to be able to assist the government to be able to successfully, successfully, deliver on their mandate around being able to make a success of the higher education space. So I would say, from our perspective as Fundi, is that we all need to pull together our resources, including the technologies, including the few rands that we have. I mean, Prof made a comment that's very interesting around a 10 rand. I mean, a 10 rand can go a very long way, and that is something that we also have an initiative at Fundi, where we're saying it's not only a government problem, it's not only a private institutions and corporate South Africa's problem, but it's every South African's problem. So let's all dig in and say, how do we put all our resources together? Each and every single rand does go a long way, but we can only be able to do this if we pull ourselves together as a country. We pull our resources together, we pull technology together. I mean, we've got SARS on our side, we've got we've got banks on our side, we've got institutions that have very good systems on our side, and you've got players like ourselves that are ready to help and facilitate and make sure that we all solve this problem together.
I wonder, Mr. Dibakwane, if there are any sort of blockages that you have observed through your work that you think if we remove those almost instantly, we'd be able to actually free up the process a lot more and allow more private participation in what we're trying to do in getting as many young people as possible into university.
Any blockages that we might have observed from our
Yes, in terms
perspective?
of trends in the funding space.
Sure. I think what we've seen is that, students struggle to register as a starting point. Okay, and students also probably don't always have the right information. Okay, and students find themselves having to actually go about trying to do research, but then they don't necessarily have even the right resources. So I think what's very important is that, first of all, we need to make sure that information is available at their fingertips. That's why people like ourselves exist, to be able to help students with information. But then on the other hand is that, we need platforms such as these. We need opportunities to be able to participate in all the different, platforms, as Prof. Mtose has indicated, where, institutions such as, universities, government entities that have higher education are always, first of all, looking to find, ways of unlocking the potential that is out there. Because at the moment, I think our focus is a lot around there isn't enough. But it's about how do we actually utilize the little that we have, as opposed to focusing on there isn't enough. And I think, the use of technology is going to be very critical to be able to solve some of these challenges.
How do you see technology as part of the broader solution?
So first of all, being able to disseminate information to students, students being able to register seamlessly, students being able to find out information around what funding is available. NSFAS is not the only solution. Being able to pull resources together, like all the different bursary providers, onto easily accessible platforms. For me, that I believe is something that's very key and important. Pulling information together around courses, what students are able to study, being able to make this information available even for students at basic education level, so that by the time they get to higher education, they are already empowered in terms of what they can do, what they can study, and what are their, what is available in terms of different funding opportunities. There's also different, funding methods like, crowdfunding. All of these have to be readily available for our people and be publicized, because there are a lot of people out there that are doing a lot of good work. Some of them might be our competitors, but we are always happy to share, their successes. Phoenix, the likes of Phoenix, do a lot of work, and we're always happy to bring everybody together in order to ultimately be able to pull the resources together using technology and making information available at the fingertips of our students and our partners.
Professor Schreiber, let me come to you. I've seen you do a lot of nodding, a lot of note-taking. Your reflections so far?
Just a quick one. I'm so aware of time, and I was wondering whether which I'm going to grade and see what is the most important thing I do want to say. I want to just remind us, I come from UWC, that is sort of my background, and Brian O'Connell was always saying we have very little, and when we spread it, we must remember everybody will have little. So we must be careful that in our uneven society, we don't look at wealthy students or wealthy people and think if we spread things right, we can be like that. It's unrealistic that some of us are really wealthy is already a problem. We should just remember what our ambitions are and how, when we spread things, that everybody gets little, and that we need to be okay with that. We need to. So I thought I'd just put that out there. The second thing I think that universities could try and do perhaps slightly different in their offerings. We could try do more online offerings. We could try stagger our offerings so our students can work perhaps for a semester and then return. So we need to be much more flexible with our students when they study, how they study. Some may study in the day. They want to be learning in the afternoons or the evenings. Now in the online environment, that is possible. So I encourage universities to think about online as a flexible offering. Perhaps condense some degrees so that people, even during the holidays, perhaps can study, perhaps enable returning students, also focus on returning students. Some students may do 1 and 2 years, have to go away, work, there are kinds of reasons why people interrupt their studies, return. And also be more flexible around transferring students. We have students that may go to a TVET, want to arrive at university, and even change across universities. So I think universities can do a little bit more around flexibility and opening up pathways for students so that they're not quite as rigid. That might enable students to work in between or have all kinds of attend to family or whatever they need to do. Those are my two key points at this point. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schreiber. Professor Mbedi, we could be more flexible, Dr. Schreiber was saying. How flexible are you able to be? Do you think that going more online perhaps would be a great way to make sure that more people are included, especially those who don't have the means to study in the conventional way?
Agreed. I agree with you 100%. Online is the way to go. Obviously, we need a mix, of bricks and mortar setup, but also online. And at the University of Johannesburg, we have started, in our own small way to open up some of the open, online courses. We've got 6 today that anybody can do free of charge. One is Introduction to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Another one is Africa Insights. The third one is Intro to Sustainable Development Goals. You do it online at your own pace, and then you get a certificate, But that is not enough. Dr. Schreiber made an important point that we are investigating as a university in terms of staking, of qualifications to enable, students to hop on and off. The carousel model is also another one where people can hop on and off, and not to sort of in many ways restrict people to register at certain times of the year. That flexibility will help a lot. But there's an important point that I don't want us to lose. As universities, as we grapple with the issue of funding, we must also make sure that our students are employable. And at the end of the day, we're also flexible. We have got ways to deal with students with historic debt, especially those that have completed. We are able to give prospective employers access to confirm that the student has indeed completed a qualification if they want to hire that student. We've got digital certificates that prospective employers can access and then can help a student get a job. But I would go as far as saying such students must also remember that when they get jobs, they must contribute to the best of their ability to settle their debts, because often once people move on, they say, well, I don't care. And that is a problem in this society because we only think about ourselves. We don't think about the next person.
Professor Ndose, we're talking about flexibility, a sort of ability or structure that would allow people in higher education, students, to hop on, hop off to raise money or get a job in the interim and then hop back on. And that last part is what is important to do, isn't it? To make sure those who leave for a moment do indeed come back and finish, because in our context, that is one of the main ways that they can better their fortunes in the longer term.
Thank you very much for that question. I think the issue raised by Dr. Schreiber is very, very important, but I'm going to tap into it from a different approach or premise that during COVID, we have managed to teach students using online resources. And what we have taken as a decision at the University of Zululand is that the gains we have made at that time cannot go, we can't lose them. We must also continue with that approach. But we are also cognizant of the fact that the higher education institutions are site accredited. Therefore, if you have been accredited to be a face-to-face university, that's what you are, and that's how you are paid or funded. Therefore, having a hybrid approach is the only way we can go, where students have got face-to-face, but at the same time, the lecturer has put on record what that lecturer was doing. And I found that to be very beneficial for students who have missed the classes for various reasons, whether they had flu or they were sick or they couldn't attend, because now they can go online and really do their own revision. For me, this flexibility is needed, but at the same time, we need to look at the parameters of doing that, because as Professor Marwana always said, something like, we will never replace face-to-face or teaching with online or online teaching. Well, so I believe strongly in that. But at the same time, the issue that is being raised that people can take a break and leave. The problem I have is that in terms of the curriculum in our country, we chop and change. I must put it that way. We have got a new curriculum for nurses from last year moving forward. Now, when students take that gap, the disadvantage is that when you come back, you realize that the curriculum has already changed and moved on. So I would encourage the online platforms or hybrid teaching as a way to go, as opposed to taking a break. If, for example, you are in Cape Town, I don't have that disadvantage here at Zululand because there are no restaurants where my students can go and work. But it's other ailments or other things that will make them not being able to go to the class. Posting those lectures online platforms really assist the students to do their own revision, as also feel like they've been part of the class all the time. And I will put it at that. And thank you very much.
Abusheni, as we conclude your final reflections, and as we do that, I'm hoping to get your thoughts as well on what was an earlier point raised around merit-based assistance, basically in this student funding situation where those who do get funding must be the most deserving, most qualified.
Just making sure that I'm unmuted. Firstly, I'm definitely going to agree with the hybrid system of having face-to-face, but also putting it, making sure that it's accessible online. And I think it's not just during the course of the year, but it's especially now where a lot of students are crying about being afraid of being left behind. So I think things like that would just be so beneficial. And then I think to the merit of the case, one of our IDP goals is about advancing the academic project. So I think when we say that we want to advance the academic projects, disbarring or disadvantaging a student from being able to proceed in getting their academic goal because they can't finance it, it's very disheartening. So I think that's something that should always be put pressure on. And thank you again for the platform.
Right, I'm also very aware of time. We're about 2 minutes or so over. I'm seeing a lot of some of the questions that we're getting online, and a lot of them have to do with some of the offerings from Fundi. I know this was more of a solution-seeking initiative, a conversation more broadly, but I'm seeing, Mr. Dibakwane, a few questions, in fact, about whether Fundi caters to private institutions such as Varsity College. Do you help students with artisan courses? So perhaps as we get your final thoughts, you can weave that into it for us.
Okay, thank you very much. I think maybe as a general and overview of, because I think all of those questions are somehow interlinked. So Fundi primarily focuses around the higher education. So if you are studying at an accredited higher education, then we are able to support you, because obviously we want to make sure that a student is studying towards a course that will result in employability, and that the certificate will be worth the paper it's written on, first of all. And then secondly, we are supporting even part-time. We also even fund short-term courses. So as long as it's a higher education related, or even related to your career, or very specific courses. So we are very flexible in that regard. Yeah, I think that covers, including postgraduates. So I think that covers all of those specific questions. But I think from my point of view, I think this is a very complex matter that we actually dealing with, and I must say that I'm very encouraged when I hear the speakers that we have today and the passion that they have around this particular space. I think we really in good hands if we are able to get around the right tables and get the right audience, such as government and corporate South Africa, to be able to buy into how do we solve this bigger problem of a higher education challenges in our country, because we all know that ultimately we can only build this country by empowering the youth, being able to allow them to be able to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and warm themselves, right? Put a roof over their heads, and actually look forward to something in the future. And that's the only way we're going to be able to build this country. And those solutions can only come from, a collaboration and partnerships from all the different stakeholders, starting in this room and then having the conversations around the right tables. Thank you.
Mr. Mahau Dibakwane, thank you so much, CEO at Fundi, and thank you to the rest of our panelists today for this webinar on student funding. Professor Xoliswa Mdose, VC at the University of Zululand, Professor Mbedi from the University of Johannesburg, also VC there. Dr. Birgit Schreiber, thank you to you as well. And Ms. Abusheni Kyala, SRC President, part of what has been hopefully an engaging and solution-orientated discussion that we've been having since this morning. And that is how we come to the end of our conversation. From myself, Thembekile Mrototo, thank you to all of you for your time and your participation, and I hope it's been fruitful. Thank you.
Thank you.
I am more. The road to becoming more
begins with knowing more,
with the desire to achieve more,
to learn more,
to grow more.
More embraces lifelong values,
more treats others with dignity,
more serves with excellence,
more shares knowledge,
more has integrity,
more walks the talk,
more is always on time,
more does the right thing,
more is innovative,
more is curious, more is open-minded and creative,
more always adds value,
more leads by example,
more is energetic and passionate,
more welcomes diversity,
more says what needs to be said,
more turns work into play, a manager into a leader,
familiar faces into family,
colleagues into friends,
more funds a learner's dream, helps realize a family's ambition,
elevates a community,
and more so, builds a nation.
More than a provider of financial solutions, we are enablers of dreams. Fundi, know more, be more.